Hey people, this is Mr. Griffin, back with a subject that you can tell by the picture and you can see by the title that I have to admit is pretty near and dear to me. And that is the subject of Bret Hart's younger brother, the late, great Owen Hart. Now, let's go back a little bit. Owen Hart started, just like Bret, in the Canadian Stampede area. I think by that time, it was a rebooted Stampede area, ran by Bruce Hart, the older brother of Bret and Owen. Owen Hart was a star over there, and he was also a star internationally in Japan and in Mexico, both as himself and as the Blue Blazer. He had many great matches with many of Japan's top stars, and he had a notable match which many people aren't aware of, both masked and unmasked. He had several matches with now the late and now infamous Chris Benoit as well, which were they were very good. Just judging, not judging the people, but judging on just, their quality of match. It was very good. I think one of them is on YouTube. If I think about it, I'll put the link down there to it so you can watch if you care to. But back to Owen. His journey took him through many places. One of his stops, believe it or not, was WCW. And I actually had the privilege of seeing him live when WCW back in 1981 was not a minor company, but not as big as it would become later. They came down here to Bluefield, West Virginia, and I remember he took on one of the Moondogs, but he managed to make a very entertaining match out of it. And you could tell, how you could just feel when somebody's a prick or if somebody's really a good guy. Well, I felt the latter with Owen. Owen seemed like a pretty good, genuine person, and I enjoyed watching him wrestle live that night. Then later, of course, he would eventually come to WWE. First as a part of a tag team with now Hall of Famer Coco Beware, and I'm still trying to figure that latter one out. Then he started making random excursions into singles wrestling. In fact, I think it's one of his first big singles match. Well, actually, let me go back. I said he was part of Coco Beware with High Energy. Actually, before that, he was part of a tag team called the New Foundation with Jim the Anvil Neidhart. And they actually were not a bad tag team. They were different from the original Hart Foundation of Bret and Jim. They were different. They were similar in a lot of ways, but they were different in a lot of ways. Owen was definitely more high-flying than Bret, which that added an element that you didn't see with the original Harts. Their tag team work was pretty good. If you have a copy available of the Royal Rumble 1992, they had a decent opener with the Oriental Express, which I would encourage you to watch just to see that tag team. Then let's jump to late 1993, when Owen's real push began. It started at Survivor Series when Bret, Owen, I think Bruce, and Keith Hart took on Shawn Michaels and his Knights. Basically a bunch of jobbers in masks, except for Shawn. In that one, Owen Hart ended up being the only Hart brother eliminated from the match. And it was partially due to Bret Hart, by accident, of course, but It was due to Bret nonetheless. And that planted the seeds for a feud between Bret and Owen, which back in the day, they would actually let something brew and brew. And then finally, after a couple of months or so, they would pull the trigger on it. Well, they didn't start the feud right away. It was a blow up and then a couple of interviews, but then things calmed down until a few months later at the Royal Rumble, when they finally pulled the trigger on Bret versus Owen. Then at WrestleMania 10, Bret and Owen had what I still call the best opening match of WrestleMania ever. I still call it that years later. It easily could have been an upper mid-card bout. Very easily. If even pushed right, maybe even a main event. Owen was put over by Bret in that match, and put over cleanly. And then later, they would go on to have a classic cage match at SummerSlam 1994, which amazingly was actually not the main event. The main event of that card was that horrible Undertaker versus Undertaker match, which, you know, that just shows that sometimes even the mighty WWE has a lapse in judgment. But then after that, Owen would have various feuds, and he would go on to win various championships. I think his first championship came in 1995 when he and the late Yokozuna defeated the Smoking Guns. That was the guy that would be later known as Badass Billy Gunn and his kayfabe brother Bart Gunn. They would defeat them at WrestleMania 11 in one of the, well, it wasn't a great match, but it was one of the few highlights of an otherwise horrible WrestleMania. And he would also go on to hold the tag team championship with Davey Boy Smith. Owen Hart would also become a European champion in 1998, and I think his highest accomplishment was holding the Intercontinental title in 1997. By that point, he was part of the Hart Foundation, which was reformed with Bret as a lead man, and then we had Jim the Anvil Neidhart back in the fold. We had Owen Hart, and we had the British Bulldog, and we also had the late Brian Pillman. And I have to say, that was one of the best done angles ever in WWE, maybe even in wrestling, because they got so much heat from the United States audience and so much heat from the Canadian audience. Of course, the heat from the Canadian audience was positive, whereas they would come back to the States, they would get booed out of the building. I mean, other than the Attitude Era, I've never seen crowds that hot ever in WWE. Unless you're going to compare, let's say, the Attitude Era or the heyday of Hulkamania. It's about the only comparisons I can think of right off. And then, after the whole Montreal Screwjob incident, things kind of went downhill. Owen would go on to win another tag team championship with TNA founder Jeff Jarrett. And this is where it starts to get beginning of the end for Owen. Apparently, Vince Russo wanted to do an angle where Owen Hart, I mean, because it's always been implied that Jeff Jarrett and Deborah McMichael, the now ex-wife of Stone Cold Steve Austin, were together. But they wanted to do an angle to imply that Owen Hart and her were having an affair. And Owen, understandably, didn't want to do it because he said, look, I got a wife at home. I got 2 kids that watch me wrestle. I do not want to be involved in this angle. So, as the story goes, Vince Russo, out of spite, since Owen didn't want to go along with that, decided to put him back in the blue blazer costume and more or less make him a comedy parody, which Owen was not crazy about, but he had a family to support. So came Kansas City. Owen Hart was supposed to enter from the ceiling, but as we know now, the equipment was not properly adjusted or something. I forgot exactly what, but he fell about 75, 80 feet from the ceiling into the ring. And even though they announced he died at the hospital, many say he was already dead in the ring. And while I won't get into it, there is controversy to this day over whether or not the WWE should have even continued that card. While I understand the show must go on, I have to be honest. If I were in that position, and I think most people would have understood, I would have probably stopped it at that point. I mean, I cannot see how in good conscience you could do that. I mean, to continue the show, if a guy's injured, that's one thing. But for somebody that died and for you to just continue on the show, I don't know. That's just a little moral problem with me. Then, of course, was the now famous Monday Night Raw, which was a tribute to Owen Hart. And you can see the genuine outpouring, not only from the fans, but from the wrestlers. I mean, guys that you could never picture openly weeping over the death of this man. I mean, they were just tore up, devastated. I mean, it wasn't just WWE. Even many WCW wrestlers at the time. I remember watching not that long ago, actually it was ironically a few months before the murder-suicide, I remember watching Hard Knocks, the Chris Benoit story. You could see when he would discuss Owen, there was a genuine, because normally Benoit was pretty robotic, you know, in his interviewing, but you could see the genuine emotion come out of him when discussing Owen. I'm sure wherever he is, be it heaven or hell, and this kind of leads to what I'm going to really be discussing in a second. If you was to ask Chris Benoit who should go in the Hall of Fame, himself or Owen, I kind of suspect he would probably say Owen. Which kind of leads to what I'm going to get at. Now, out of all the wrestlers that you could argue that should be in the Hall of Fame, and there are quite a few, the Road Warriors, which I understand they finally got in this year, which is good. You could argue about Bruno Sammartino, who I understand has been offered that, but he's turned it down. Same with Bob Backlund. And definitely Macho Man Randy Savage, who should have been in a long time ago. Which, by the way, on a side note, I will be pissed if he is not inducted in at the next WrestleMania. But back to Owen. If anybody should have been in the Hall of Fame a long time ago, it definitely should have been Owen Hart. Definitely. But from what I understand, Martha Hart, the widow of Owen, wants nothing to do with pro wrestling in general or WWE in particular. But here's the thing that I find hypocritical about that. She wants nothing to do with WWE. She doesn't want her husband in the Hall of Fame yet. Recently, not too long ago, she filed a suit against WWE for using her husband's image and likeness during the Hart family anthology, and want to sue for other royalties concerning the use of her image on other videos, which I can name several: the WrestleMania anthology, the Royal Rumble anthology, the Survivor Series anthology, and I know he was on the Stone Cold story video that came out a couple of years ago. Only thing I got a problem with is she's filing this suit. She wants nothing to do with WWE, yet she wants their money. I mean, and I know I might get heat for saying this, but she's really coming off as a hypocritical, money-hungry bitch. I'm sorry. I mean, I know that's terrible to say, but that's how she's coming off to me. And I'll tell you what, if Owen Hart is forgotten in the next, say, 5-10 years, part of the blame, sure, some of the blame will be WWE's, but a lot of the blame, in my view, will be hers. Owen Hart deserves to be remembered. He deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. Just as much as Savage, just as much as San Martino, just as much as Bob Backlund. And Owen Hart, quite honestly, definitely should have got it before some of these others that are in the WWE Hall of Fame. I mean, certainly Coco Beware. Oh, hell yeah. He should have got in long before him. But because Martha Hart doesn't want to do business other than trying to get money out of him, he's not there. She refuses to sign the Legends contract, which would put him in the Hall of Fame. Now, in some ways, I understand where she's coming from. I mean, the accident that took her husband's life could have been totally avoided. I understand where she's coming from. But you know what? At some point, no matter what was done to you that was wrong, so wrong, at some point, you've got to move past that, got to move on. I've known people in my personal life who couldn't get over a certain incident, and they ended up dying prematurely. Or if they lived, the quality of life was horrible. And from what I understand, she has not allowed her kids to see any members of the Hart family since the death of Owen. Which, if that's true, then that's very, very, very sad and very, very petty on her part, if that's true. I mean, I guess I'm a little emotional about this because I really, really want Owen Hart to be remembered. He deserves to be remembered and honored just as much as his brother Bret Hart. And that's not a knock on Bret Hart at all. Bret Hart deserves his Hall of Fame. He deserves his status. But Owen Hart, his brother, deserves it just as much. And by the way, on the whole suit against him for using his likeness and his image, I personally think that whole suit, I mean, and I don't like the WWE's lawyer. He kind of pissed me off during the whole Benoit murder-suicide thing with his little attitude and his all bring it on, which I think is totally unprofessional for a lawyer. I really do. But I will agree with him on this. He says that the suit is without merit, which legally I believe it is. Unless Martha Hart can show some document where WWE actually promised or produced some footage where Vince McMahon verbally said this, to me, she doesn't have a case. And quite honestly, it's petty. Because, I mean, when it comes down to it, if these two sides, particularly Mrs. Hart, would do fucking business with each other, they would, both sides would be better off. She would probably get the royalties and money she wants. WWE ends up ends up looking good PR wise, and more importantly to someone like me and probably to a lot of fans, Owen Hart finally gets his just acknowledgement and just due. For me personally, that's what I want. That's what I want to see. But sadly, this may never happen, because we know WWE can be pricks. I mean, let's face it, they can be. But I think WWE is always willing to do business, especially if it benefits them. Martha Hart, on the other hand, just wants the money. Other than that, she wants nothing to do with WWE. But at the same time, she doesn't realize she is making sure that her husband, within 10 to 15 years, won't be forgotten. Will be forgotten, I mean. Yeah, sure, Owen Hart will be remembered by my generation and maybe the current generation. But 20, 30 years from now, I would not be surprised if you bring up the name Owen Hart and someone goes, "Who's Owen Hart?" And the blame will partially be on WWE, but the blame will mostly be on Martha Hart if her husband is forgotten. And yeah, I know I'm probably going to get some thumbs down. I'm probably going to get a lot of heat. But you know what? Fuck you. This is my opinion. And to me, she's just as much to blame, if not more. While I do sympathize with her loss, because like I said, it was needless. I do sympathize with her loss. At some point, you got to get past that. And I know I'm repeating myself, but as I said earlier, this whole lawsuit over royalties, over those videos, unless she has some legal document or some kind of judgment, she's just wasting her time with that and being damn foolish. I mean, this is just like with the Goldmans chasing after O.J. Simpson. But at least with the Goldmans, they actually won a judgment against him. They actually have legal backing. Martha Hart, as far as I know, does not have that. And plus, the wrongful death of her husband, that suit was paid a long time ago, from what I understand. So she can't say that. Anyway, I'll quit rambling and ranting, but I just want this man, this honorable man, this good man, to be honored by WWE. And I get the feeling that they want to honor him, but because Martha Hart continues to be stubborn and basically won't get out of her own way, that will probably never happen. And that in itself is a tragedy. Well, if you have any comments, leave them down below. You can even make a video response to this if you want. I'm out. Well, you just listened to the main body on what I think of Owen Hart and about him being in the Hall of Fame. This part I decided to tack on to this is on Martha Hart. Now, as one human being to another, I understand her anger and even sympathize with her loss completely, because it was needless. But here's my thing. Everyone has had loss, whether it was through natural causes or something unjust. At some point, you got to move on with your life. Now, granted, she has done that somewhat. I understand she has a charity organization in the name of Owen Hart, and she does seem to have some relationship with a few wrestlers. I think she's, or at least she was, on good terms with Jeff Jarrett. And I know Mick Foley has come to some of her events here and there. But when it comes to the WWE and this whole suing them for using the husband's image, she don't want her husband's image used by them. At some point, she's got to let it go. She really does. And the fact that she doesn't want their image used, yet she's trying to sue them or try to get money, or is trying to claim that they have defrauded her royalties for years, when there's no legal documentation that says otherwise, just makes her look, like I said earlier in the video, makes her look like a hypocritical, money-hungry bitch. I'm sorry. I know some people might say, well, you're misogynistic or you're being sexist. Well, I'm sorry. That's how she's making herself look. And it's really sad. Actually, I pity her more than I hate her. Actually, I don't hate her at all. I actually pity her. Because she's really, really losing out by not dealing with WWE. Granted, WWE are snakes. We know that. But hey, if they would honor Owen Hart, it would number one, make them look good. Number two, it could give her, she could take that money and do what she wants, continue to fund her charity organization. I mean, sometimes you just have to swallow pride and do business. I'm sure Bret Hart is still not overly fond of Vince McMahon after the whole Montreal Screwjob thing. But Bret Hart was able to put aside his differences and do business. That's why he's in the Hall of Fame. That's why that video that came out in 2005, instead of being called Screw the Bret Hart Story, it became Bret Hart, the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be. Why? Because he put his personal differences aside and did business. And I realize I can't tell this woman what to do or anything, but I feel like this is what she should do to end all of this. And you know who will benefit the most? The fans. Because the fans want Owen to be honored. They really do. They want him to be honored. But because these two sides continue to be stubborn in their ways, we probably will never see that happen. At least not in my lifetime. I hope I'm wrong on that. I really do. And I guess she kind of got my anger a little bit over certain comments she made in that book about Owen, saying that wrestling fans are low IQ, that they're stupid, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's basically the gist. Well, got news for you, Mrs. Hart. I just happen to be a college-educated man with a BA in communications with emphasis in broadcast journalism. And I consider myself a pretty sensible guy. And most people consider me a pretty sensible guy. So I'm hardly the brain-dead fan that you described. In fact, a lot of fans are not brain-dead. And that may not be what she said, but that's what she implied. And then the comments she made about some of the wrestlers, I find appalling in that book. Like, first she said Andre the Giant died in the 80s. I'm like, no, he died in 1993. That's public knowledge. That's public record. And saying that Stone Cold Steve Austin was not really injured by Owen at SummerSlam 97. Now, I'm sure Owen did not intend to injure Austin, but to even suggest that the man really was not injured, that just shows a lack of respect and a lack of looking up her facts on her part. And it actually shows the bitterness she still has within her about losing her husband, Owen. And furthermore, for a woman that puts down the wrestling business, the wrestling business is the reason you and your kids have been able to live, I'm sure, fairly comfortably. Especially in a day and age when people are out of work, out of jobs, can't get a job, owes all kinds of bills with everybody with their hand out, but no money to pay them, I'm sure you're doing pretty okay because of the wrestling business. So, I know I'm sounding angry and bitter, and part of me is. But at the same time, I really pray one day this woman can put her personal feelings aside and do what's right. I really do. Well, now I am really finished with this video. Peace.